Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and start a couple of minutes early, I hope, with a prayer that we would all call to mind the people in the Eastern Mediterranean who are suffering so much through the conflicts and the wars that are going on now, as they have for so many years. And in fact, you'll hear in just a couple of moments as I summarize what was going on 2,000 years ago, that things weren't so different even then. So I ask ask God to bring us peace with justice and bring us the wisdom to get there. Quick summary of what I tried to convey last week, which was essentially a picture of what the state of Israel, or Israel, looked like in the early first century. It was very agrarian, subsistence agriculture, frequent famines, lots of starvation, lots of very, very heavy taxation of food. Taxes were paid with a portion of food to ensure that Romans had bread, while the people in the colonies often didn't. Obviously, Israel was, or Palestine, Palestinia at that time, was a colony of the Roman Empire and a very troublesome one. Some historians have suggested that Rome would have destroyed Palestine if it could have. But at that time, Rome was very dependent on Palestine as the crossroads for virtually everything it got from Egypt and from India and places east. It was a very, very critical linchpin in the trade that supported Rome. And so Rome had to try to deal with it. And throughout this period, in fact, during the period when Jesus was walking on the earth, the Romans were actively attempting to replace Jerusalem and the port city of Yafo, which appears in Paul's letters, with other more modern Roman cities, including Caesarea Maritima, which is farther up the coast, and Acco, a city that came to light during the Crusades. But essentially, Rome was attempting to create new entrepôts to get goods and food to Rome, because they couldn't rely on Jerusalem and Yafo, which were in such turmoil. Israel's religion could not be easily adapted into the Roman Empire, mainly because, of course, it was monotheistic. And the Romans were basically pantheists. They accepted many, many gods. The notion that there would be only one God was absolutely foreign to them, and they feared it, assuming that if the empire ever got to the point of accepting only one God, then the other gods in wrath would destroy the empire. Jerusalem was an armed city. It was walled. The gates were carefully controlled. Roman legionnaires roamed the streets of Jerusalem, both before and after the time of Jesus, heavily armed, always in pairs, sometimes in fours, because there were assassins running around the city, attempting to harass the Roman legions at the same time. So there was terrorism within Jerusalem. Certainly, we didn't see the kinds of mass destruction that we see today, given the kinds of things we can now do to each other. But at that time, at least, there were techniques, throwing rocks, knifing. There was even a name given to the bands of knife-wielding terrorists. They were called the Zakarai. That means there were quite a large number of them, for example. So there were many, many forms of Judaism going on at this time. The notion that that you could point to Palestine and say there's a Palestinian people and a Palestinian religion is just a false one. It just didn't exist. So we come to today's note, which is part 3 of the materials that were given out to, this week and last week. And that really focuses on Jesus and his role in the birth of Christianity. First of all, I want to make what may be the most obvious statement you've heard in this place in years, and that is Jesus was a real historical figure. He walked on the face of the earth. The only reason I make that statement is that I gave this talk at an FGCU-sponsored event a couple of years ago, and several 20-somethings walked up to me afterwards and said, "Do you really believe he actually was a person?" They were just assuming that he was a Zeus or an Apollo or some of the other fictional Roman gods who were roaming around, or maybe not roaming around at that time. We as Christians, of course, believe that Jesus was both man and the Son of God. And that, of course, raises one of the fundamental questions for everything I'm going to say for the rest of these minutes. And that is, if we believe that Jesus was man, as we profess in our creed, then he needed to be a human being in every sense of being a human being. And that means that he wasn't necessarily in control of everything that would happen to him or after him, or to his friends, or to those he sent out in mission during his life. And yet, as God, he must, an all-powerful God, he must have known that these things would happen, and he must, of course, have intended them. And that, of course, makes it very, very difficult to talk about history when you're given those two propositions right at the beginning. But it is important for us to recognize that is, in fact, the case. And that's what we believe. He was a Jew. We think he lived for about 30 to 35 years. We're not exactly sure. Obviously in Israel at the beginning of the first century. And I guess it's safe to say that without him, there probably would be no Christianity. Incidentally, the word Christianity dates back to the late first century, and it was first used in Antioch, in Syria, modern-day Syria, a city that no longer exists as such. And we believe that the Christian Jews in Antioch began to refer to themselves as Christians, as opposed to the other Jews and disciples of Christ who referred to themselves as followers of the way. And so the word Christianity probably dates back to the 70s in Antioch. There were certainly messianic expectations within Judaism while Jesus was walking on the face of the earth. In fact, the word Messiah goes all the way back to the time of Moses and Aaron. And the first use of the word Messiah, spelled in M-A-S-I-A-H in Hebrew, is when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the Decalogue. Aaron asks him, Aaron, his brother, the then high priest of that ancient cult of Judaism, asked his brother Moses to appoint other priests because he was too busy and he didn't have enough time to serve all of the people as they were wandering through the desert. And Moses agrees, and they anoint a number of men to be assistants to Aaron. And that anointing, Messiah, which is exactly what Messiah means, it's anointing with oil, that was the very first use. Subsequently, it became a part during the kingdom, the United Kingdom of Israel, and David, Solomon, and Saul were all anointed king of Israel. And so it became a sacred kind of notion. But by the time of Christ, the notion of the Messiah was essentially an individual who was going to restore the Israel of the United Kingdom and probably to throw off Roman rule. That's an issue which has become quite controversial quite recently, and a number of rabbinical departments at various universities around the United States and Europe have begun to teach that the Jews did not reject Jesus as the Messiah because he didn't lead them out from under Roman rule. That was not expected. And then a careful reading of the prophets suggests that that was never going to be the role of the Messiah, and that very notion is a Christian notion, not a Jewish notion. These same groups of rabbinical studies will say to us that the reason that the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah was that his followers claimed he was the Son of God. And that violated the basic monotheism of Judaism. There could not be two gods. There could not be a God the Father and a God the Son. And at that time, at least, we were not able to get through the issues of, guess what? Trinity, and the notion of the one God in Trinity. The canonical Gospels don't tell us too much about the early life of Jesus. We know all of us can probably recite almost by heart the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke. And of course, there is no nativity story in Mark. Mark's gospel begins with his baptism in the Jordan when he's about 30 years old. Luke talks a little bit about his presentation in the temple, presumably an early form of bar mitzvah. But that's all we know until the Gospels begin to talk about his adult life, presumably around 30 years old. We're not even sure that he actually preached for 3 years. I think if you ask most Christians, they will tell you the adult life of Jesus was 3 years. That's based upon only one fact, and that is the Gospel of John describes 3 Passovers during the preaching time of Jesus, thus suggesting 3 years of preaching. But Matthew and Luke have only 1 Passover. And so the period of time in which he did in fact preach may have been quite a bit shorter than 3 years. When you think about that very situation, it is really quite amazing. And it becomes significantly easier, I think, to accept the fact that the Spirit was with him and that he in fact shared in the divinity of his Father. In a period of 1 to 3 years, a man without television, radio, internet, newspapers, or any other form of mass communication changed the world. An amazing statement when you think about it. The multi-volume biography of Jesus written by John Meyer of Notre Dame attempts to describe several aspects of Jesus's ministry. He talks about Jesus as a rabbi or a teacher. A teacher at that time, a rabbi, would have drawn anywhere from a half dozen to a dozen young men, typically around 12, 13, and it would have taught them the Torah for a period of 3 to maybe 6 years. We're pretty sure that Paul went through that kind of an education when he went to Jerusalem and left Tarsus. But at any rate, there were many rabbis, some more famous than others, and young teenage boys typically were grouped around a rabbi to learn of the Torah. Clearly, the way Jesus gathers his disciples around him and teaches them reminds us very, very significantly that he was in fact a rabbi. And in fact, several of the disciples in the Gospels are quoted as calling him rabbi or teacher. The second description that John Meyer gives him is that he was a faith healer. That's a much more controversial situation. Apparently, during the first century, particularly the first half of the first century, a large group of individuals, Jews, traveled to Egypt and took some sort of medical and spiritual training, and then came back to Israel as faith healers and sold their services. And John Meyer goes to great lengths to demonstrate that Jesus, although many of the things he did in his adult life resembled those that the faith healers did, there were several things that distinguished him quite distinctly from the other faith healers. First, he never charged. Second, he never used incantations or exotic words. And third, he rarely expected the people he healed to even thank him at the end. And so he was really quite different from the other faith healers that were running around. And obviously, he was an itinerant preacher. In that sense, he may have been like the storytellers that continued for many, many years throughout Israel. Having had no methods of mass communication, the families, large extended families, would often host storytellers. And over the main meal of the day, the storyteller would tell stories about what was going on within Palestine and would essentially spread the news, so to speak. A lot of what Jesus did and what his disciples later did seems to have followed that pattern as well. We also refer to Jesus as high priest. That name probably did not fit him during his lifetime. It probably arose late in the first century or early in the second century. And the theology of the high priesthood of Jesus really comes from the book from the letter to the Hebrews, which is in the New Testament. So during his lifetime, at least, Jesus was not referred to as a priest. You'll remember that there was a high priest in Jerusalem, in fact, several dozen of them during the lifetime of Jesus. The high priest was typically served by a group of anywhere from 20 to 50 men. The men would come to the temple from each of the tribes of Israel and serve 1 month. And so the assistant priests in the temple were temporary. And while they were in the temple, they would be celibate, and they would be under the authority of the high priest. And then they would go home to their tribes, and they would switch each month. There's no evidence whatsoever that Jesus participated in that at all. I'd like to turn a little bit to some of the questions that are asked of Jesus in terms of the question you hear most often, particularly from non-believers, is, do you really believe that Jesus founded Christianity? Good question, if you think about it. Obviously, the preaching of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels and in the letters, suggests that he was teaching the basic behavioral morality which became foundational for Christianity. However, it was nearly identical to the morality which was being practiced in Judaism at the same time. And as a consequence, many take the next step and suggest that Jesus was, in fact, attempting to purify or convert Jews to a truer form of Judaism, and that it was only later that Christianity began to distinguish itself from Judaism. In fact, there's a good deal of historical evidence that the largest Christian community after the time of the crucifixion, it was in Jerusalem, and that community quite obviously considered themselves to be both Jews and Christians. As I will mention next week when we talk a little bit about the Jerusalem Council and Paul, they were clearly in a majority. And as a consequence, most of the early Christians believed that you needed to be a good Jew before you could be a Christian. And that was certainly the case in Jerusalem. And it was probably also the case in Antioch and in Alexandria, the two other large diaspora Christian Jewish communities from the middle of the first century. I think we need to take apart that question, did Jesus found Christianity, and ask ourselves, what exactly do we mean by that? Are we talking about a church? Are we talking about a synagogue? Are we talking about a way of life, a building, the people of God? Communion. Obviously, if the answer we look for is a spiritual one rather than a physical one, it seems pretty obvious that the Gospels lead us in that direction. And I'd like to suggest to you, however, that they may go beyond that. Let me take a few moments to describe what we get from the Gospels concerning this. The first and most obvious is the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, in fact, is sometimes referred to as the most ecclesiastical gospel, the gospel that talks most about church. In chapter 10, Matthew describes Jesus as choosing 12 apostles. Obviously, he is making clear reference to the 12 tribes of Israel and referencing back to that. Some take the next step from that and say, by doing so, he was referencing Judaism, but in fact creating something new and different. By the end of the first century, Christians were beginning to talk about apostolic succession and bishops, and the notion that the disciples of Jesus were going to become the new church. Obviously, we've all read the passage in chapter 16, where Jesus refers to Peter as the rock on whom the church will be built and gives him the keys of the kingdom. A very, very clear reference to an ecclesiastical intent. In chapter 18, we have an allegorical description of the church. And it teaches this church, this new church, will go beyond the formalism and the Torah righteousness and go toward the basic underlying teaching of Jesus, the law of love, the ultimate law which controls everything, and the necessity for the followers to undergo a personal conversion, to be in a situation where the law of love takes charge of their lives. And then, of course, toward the end of the gospel, Jesus' famous lines, whose sins you shall forgive, they shall be forgiven. And those you retain will be retained in heaven. Certainly suggests that Jesus was in fact charging his disciples and giving them authority for the future of his mission and most likely his church. And then finally, of course, we have the post-resurrection appearances, and every single one of the post-resurrection appearances has at least a few words suggesting that Jesus is charging his disciples with carrying forward his ideas to the future. You know, all of those things together, it certainly seems clear to me that the Gospel of Matthew, the authors of the Gospel of Matthew at least, understood that Jesus was in fact founding a church, something that could be identified as his church. Luke's gospel is often referred to as being non-ecclesiastic because Luke doesn't have any of these lines that are contained in Matthew's. And for many, many years, people who were arguing for spirituality but not religiosity would use Luke's gospel as the touchstone for arguing their case that one didn't need to be church, one could be spiritual without church. The only thing they failed to note, however, was something which has come to light probably within the last 70 or 80 years, and that is a firm belief among most biblical historians that the Acts of the Apostles was written by the same person or same group of people who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And there can be no question whatsoever that the Acts of the Apostles traces the history in some detail of the new church and the spiritual leadership under the Holy Spirit of that church. We see the church left behind by Jesus as coping with many of the issues, the social issues of their time, the feeding of orphans, the care of widows, the care of the sick, etc. And so we see in the Acts of the Apostles the embodiment of the behavioral morality that Jesus preaches in the gospel coming to fruition in the church of the disciples that he leaves behind, and written in some detail in the book of Acts. And as a consequence, it seems clear to me that both Matthew and Luke can be shown as suggesting strongly that Jesus did in fact found a church. Then we come to John's gospel, probably the last gospel written, maybe as late as 100, maybe as late as 60 or 70 years after the time of Jesus. People are now beginning to think that the Gospel of John may have been written by followers of John who were living in Samaria. They may even have been Samaritans. But at any rate, they were followers of the way. They were Christian Jews. And they were being regularly excluded from the synagogue because of their belief in the Son of God. And here we come to an interesting comment. Toward the end of the Hebrew Bible, in what is referred to as the wisdom literature, the notion of the Son of God with a small s is very prominent. A son of God is a person who is a righteous Jew. That is one who follows the rules of the Torah. To use Marcella's language this morning, those who were already enrolled in the book of life. Those were sons of God with a small s. And at the beginning of the period of Christianity after the death of Jesus, many Jews assumed that when the Christians were talking about Jesus as the Son of God with a capital S, they were referring to the same sons of God that the Hebrew Bible referred to hundreds of years before. But by the end of the first century, it was becoming pretty clear to the rabbinical leaders of Judaism that the Christians meant something much, much more when they used the phrase Son of God, and that they literally meant that Jesus was God as well as man. And that, of course, ran smack dab into the prohibition of the Decalogue to having false gods, having more than one God. The rigid monotheism of Judaism simply could not handle the notion that there was a Yahweh or Father God and a man God, Jesus of Nazareth. And in fact, it appears that sometime after the destruction of the temple, I'm going to take a footnote on that first. You may remember the temple was destroyed in 70. The temple was the absolute linchpin of Second Temple Judaism. It was the absolute center of Jewish life and Jewish religion. Every good Jew was required to go to the temple and make sacrifice periodically, at least once a year if possible, unless they were ill or otherwise excused. And so we have this notion of the temple being destroyed by the Romans in 70, perhaps by mistake, incidentally, we now think, that the communications were lost en route. But at any rate, we do know the temple was destroyed. And Judaism was in complete disarray. There was no center point anymore of Judaism. And most ancient historians are now beginning to come to the conclusion that the Romans decided that they could use the influential rabbis, who incidentally were also probably Pharisees, to rally the people and control the people and to quiet down this colony, this terrible colony in the Roman Empire. And so there have been a couple of tracts which have appeared in the last 10 or 20 years suggesting that the Romans actually encouraged the rabbis to meet and to begin to try to put Judaism back together as a discrete religion. We know they met in Yafo, which is current-day Jaffa, on the coast in 76. We know they met about 10 years later in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. We don't know how many. We know there were some. We don't know how many. And some decrees came out of those meetings. It appears that at least by the time of the Tiberias meeting, the rabbis modified the opening prayer of what was becoming the synagogue liturgy in diaspora Judaism. And we recognize that prayer because it's repeated almost verbatim in the Beatitudes, the blessings. And the blessing prayer that we see in the Beatitudes was, of course, in Hebrew, recited at the beginning of a synagogue meeting. And you may remember that there are two versions of the Beatitudes. One of them has blessings only, the other has blessings and curses. It appears that the prayer at the beginning of the synagogue meeting had the blessings and the curses. And from some time in the mid-70s, we think maybe as a result of this meeting in Tiberias, the Jews added a curse to the opening prayer in the synagogue. And it was basically a curse of the followers of the way for believing that Jesus was in fact God. The authors of the Gospel of John were no doubt aware of that situation, and Christians in general at that point were beginning to feel unwelcome in the synagogue. And this may have been one of the first and most important splits between Judaism and Christianity during that period. We'll talk next week about the arrival of the Gentiles in the church and how that sealed the deal. But we have this very, very interesting notion dating really back to around 75 to 80 that Jews were beginning to curse Christians as non-believers because of their violation of the basic notion of monotheism. And so we have the debate about this period, and it continues even today. I'm always asked, what my views are. I'm not sure my views are necessarily controlling, but I would say the following. I would say that certainly the behavioral morality that Jesus lived and preached is foundational for Christianity, and it did vary some, but not much, from the foundational morality of Second Temple Judaism. It, however, very, very much emphasized the notion of the law of love, the importance of love as an overriding virtue, an overriding law. And it certainly de-emphasized the formalism and the tribalism of Judaism. And therefore, it was new in that sense. I think Jesus considered himself to be a Jew. He obviously was a Jew. It became necessary for the early gospel authors to get over a small problem, and that was that Jesus apparently arrived in Jerusalem with his disciples from Galilee. And of course, there was a saying in Jerusalem at that time that nothing good ever came from Galilee. The Galileans were considered to be lesser Jews, less important Jews, dating way back to the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian invasions of 600 years before. But at any rate, Galileans were suspect. And so both of the nativity narratives are very, very careful to establish Jesus's pedigree as being, both through Mary and Joseph, as being from the southern tribes, and therefore okay within Judaism. Certainly the authors of those two gospels felt that they needed to justify the Judaism of Jesus at that time. Then, of course, there are the endless debates about whether or not Jesus followed the law, the Torah law. You'll remember that the Torah law contained in 3 different books of the Torah, 3 of the first 5 books of the Bible, amounts to about, I think the actual count is 738 rules, which governed every aspect of human life, everything you ate, everything you wore, the people you associated with, when you washed, when you got up, etc. It became a very, very difficult regime for most ordinary people to follow. And it seems that there are several passages within the descriptions in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, all 4 of the Gospels, suggesting that Jesus didn't follow every single precept contained in those 700 plus rules of the Torah. But we think that by the time of Jesus, the rules of the Torah were beginning to be seen more as cultic than really religious. And therefore, when Jesus explains when he violates the law, for example, he does things on the Sabbath that no good Jew would do if he were a righteous Jew. But each time Jesus does something on the Sabbath, which seems to be in conflict with the Torah, it's explained in the narrative that he does so out of love, out of necessity for another human being, or maybe for an animal, or for hunger, or for someone being ill. And therefore, Jesus is in fact saying we need to temper the rigidity of the rules of the Torah with this law of compassion and communion with fellow human beings. Really amazed I managed to get through this morning. Last week I thought I was way behind. I think that we are left today with some questions which are still quite modern. One, of course, is the notion of perfection versus supersessionism. Let me explain that briefly. If Jesus was perfecting Judaism, then Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism, and Judaism is foundational for Christianity, and it is worthwhile for us to study the Hebrew literature and the Hebrew history as a basis, as for the foundation of interpreting some of the ways that we do things today. If it was supersessionalism, then Jesus was throwing Judaism out and creating a whole new religion. That was the attitude that the Christians began to take by the beginning of the 2nd century. We have several important things happening at that time. There's, for example, we have a Christian in Turkey, Marcion, who publishes a very early version of what we would call today the New Testament. He basically scours through the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and he removes all of the positive references to the Jews and makes it very clear in the crucifixion that the Jews alone are responsible. And he creates the word deicide, that the Jews killed God. That is a notion which became very prevalent in the 2nd century, just after this time. And it was held by very many people. Incidentally, many of you may be aware of this, but the documents of Marcion, the Gospels of Marcion, which exist today, we have them today, or at least in some version we have them today, became the basis for Adolf Hitler's rewriting of the New Testament in the Nazi era. And so he reached back 2,000 years to those books to pick up those concepts, obviously accusing the Jews. One of the difficulties, of course, we've got with so much of this is that so much of the Jewish literature of the time was lost, either through the Inquisition, during the periods of the Inquisition, during the Holocaust, and at other times. There wasn't apparently all that much, and what we had was, in fact, lost. And so it's only now, as a result of some discoveries, recent discoveries in Babylon, that we're beginning to see a Jewish interpretation of what happened in the first century, whereas for hundreds and hundreds of years after that time, the only interpretation we had was the Christian interpretation. And of course, we all know that the victors who write history write it in a certain way. I think it's very, very important for us to continue to emphasize that the foundational morality of Christianity is almost entirely on all fours with the foundational morality of Judaism. In fact, some of the issues which are criticized by modern secularists and feminists of Christianity are equally true of Judaism, because we inherited most of those notions from the Judaic period. Next week, I'm going to talk about Paul and how Paul's admission of the Gentiles in great numbers to the church, starting around 50 to 60, completely changed Christianity by the end of the first century. It didn't necessarily change the behavioral morality that Jesus taught, but it began to bring Greek ideas and Greek philosophy into counterpoint with the Judaic parochialism and patriarchalism that we see coming out of the beginning of the first century. So I will take questions and comments. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. The best we can say is that the Gospel of John places in the mouth of Jesus many of the philosophical ideas of the Essenes. And as a consequence of that, many believe that Jesus was at least acquainted with the Essenes, possibly when he was a disciple of John the Baptist. But at least he knew of the Essenes and he knew of their philosophy. There are only two Pharisees named specifically in any of the Gospels, and in the New Testament. One of them, of course, is Paul, the author of a third of the New Testament, a Pharisee, and the other, Nicodemus, in the Gospel of John, who was converted by Jesus. And so given the attitude of the evangelists toward the Pharisees, even if we go back and say that they really weren't talking about the Pharisees, they were talking about the Sadducees in code word, the general attitude toward the formalism of the Pharisees seems to suggest very strongly, in my view, that Jesus was not a Pharisee. And he could not have been a Sadducee, given the preaching that he did about the poor and the downtrodden and those who were being victimized by the upper feudal class of Jews and intermarried Romans in Israel at the time. Long way of answering. I don't think we can directly associate Jesus with any of them. Many of you have probably seen the Broadway musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. They strongly, that strongly suggests that Judas was a zealot, one of the terrorists, and that, in fact, one of the underlying themes of that musical is picked up from some philosophical materials that the reason that Judas betrayed Jesus was that he was unhappy that Jesus had not gone far enough as a revolutionary. We don't have any evidence for that. It's a nice thought, but I don't see certainly we don't have the evidence in the Gospels. So the answer, I guess, is maybe an Essene, probably not anything else. Yes. You're talking specifically about the Middle East. Yeah. You know, of course, there's a profound pacifism in all of the Gospels. We have to admit that if Jesus were alive today, he would definitely be a pacifist, and he would definitely be opposed to any form of war to resolve any kinds of issues. I think we start with that platform. Certainly the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels are all about the disenfranchised, the sick, the poor. They are his people. And so I think we'd put both of those together. I think he would be one of the people, one of the many people calling for a cessation of hostilities immediately. The very notion that you're going to take out on an entire population the transgressions of some aggressors would be, I think, really foreign to what Jesus would preach today. I don't think I could be any more specific than that. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else? Thank you. See you next week.